I'm Mark Kingwell, professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, and I'm ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. This is the latest in our series of one-on-one conversations with thoughtful, accomplished people in many different fields. We talk to astronauts, Olympic champions, entrepreneurs, musicians, television hosts, and more. We explore their challenges, their life stories, their defining moments, and we learn from them the powerful lessons from all of that we can apply to our own lives. And we do that in two parts. We start off with some rapid-fire questions that are a lot of fun and also reveal little pieces of information about the guest, and then we start digging deep into some of the themes and stories and life lessons that emerge. Our guest today is Mark Kingwell. Mark is an academic, an author, and a prolific writer. He's a fascinating guy who has shared a unique and penetrating perspective on contemporary life. Just listen to the places where Mark Kingwell has either studied or taught: the University of Edinburgh, the University of Cambridge, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Chicago, and Yale University. Mark is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. He has written for a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, Harper's, The Walrus, The Utne Reader, and more. He is the author of more than 15 books, including his latest On Risk, and before that, Wish I Were Here, Boredom and the Interface. Mark has won a number of awards and honors, including the Spitz Prize for Political Theory. But what I really like about Mark is that he takes these big concepts and he makes them very relatable and accessible, invoking references to everything from The Simpsons to baseball, two of my favorite subjects. In our wide-ranging conversation, Mark talks about how to create meaning in our everyday lives. He talks about our skewed and flawed relationship with risk, and that includes why we're so bad at understanding risk, and also how to take smart risks. He talks about one of my favorite topics, luck and the birthright lottery. He also talks about the concept of learning how to die, and also what it means to be post-apocalyptic. Now, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to this podcast and post a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And also, share this podcast with your network. And if you're looking for more information about this episode of the show, including links to anything that we talk about, if you want to read my daily blog where I post every single day of the year, or subscribe to the Weekly Dig, my newsletter, which has 5 very quick items that I've learned about each week, then please go to our website, letsdigdeep.com. letsdigdeep.com. You can also find a link to my TEDx talk, which is actually about the birthright lottery and the role of luck in our lives. All right, let's start digging deep with Mark Kingwell. Mark, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Digging Deep. I'm very excited about this conversation. I have enjoyed your writing, and I've seen you speak many times, and we've done a few interviews before. And I just read your book, On Risk, and I'm looking forward to talking about that. So thank you very much for joining us today.
It's good to be with you, Mark. Thank you.
So let's start with some rapid fire questions, and then we'll dig into a lot of very interesting themes that you raise in your book. What is your fondest childhood memory?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think I'm going to single out a memory that I hadn't really thought about before. But when my father was stationed at CFB Greenwood in Nova Scotia, one day he took me on a road trip over to the Bay of Fundy to the little town of Digby. And we had deep fried scallops from a shack right there by the water. And it was one of the few times I remember spending the whole day just with my dad, because I have 2 siblings. And I think that's my fondest memory.
That's pretty special. Who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
That's easy. Batman.
Batman, okay. Great.
I should say the Adam West campy version of Batman, not the sort of dark versions that came up later in comic books and film.
Right. That was my first experience with Batman too, was Adam West. It sort of, I have to admit, it was an adjustment after that to sort of understand the more commonly accepted conflicted Batman.
Right. The whole Dark Knight thing was
Yeah.
really not in the picture in the 60s and 70s, but
Yeah.
now, of course, is the thing.
What did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
That's also easy. I thought I was going to be a jet fighter pilot.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, except I never even came close.
What is your life story in 6 words?
I've been thinking about this one too. Everything I know is from cats.
Everything I know is from cats, meaning
Not the Broadway show,
okay.
the actual cats.
Okay. All right. Because that was my first reaction was the musical. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
no, my actual cats who live in the house with me.
Okay. What is your greatest mistake and what did you learn from it?
I think my greatest mistake was, and this actually we can get into later. I took a very bad risk fishing in a river in upstate New York, slipped on a rock, dislocated my shoulder, and almost drowned. And what I learned from it was that at that time, I guess I was in my early 50s. I'm not as agile as I was, and you have to be careful when you're fishing.
Yes, and you have to be careful when you're in your 50s, as we both are. For what do you feel most grateful?
Just being around still, I guess, and having the opportunity to write and think and read for a living. I can't believe I get paid to do that.
What has been the best year of your life so far and why?
2002. I was living in New York, and I had just published a book that I was proud of, that I am proud of. I'd just been promoted to full professor, and I moved back to Toronto, and I was introduced to the woman who would become the love of my life.
Nice. What was the toughest year of your life so far and why?
Also academically related, 1996. Had finished my PhD, had published a little bit, but the job market was ridiculously bad, as it is now for my graduate students. And I honestly didn't know what I was going to do with my life.
What one person has had the greatest impact on your life?
I'd have to say my mother, because she passed just over a year and a half ago, and she was she was a tough lady. She taught me a lot about discipline, duty, and thriftiness, and very very old school, old world kinds of virtues, and those things stay with me every day still.
What is the most important lesson that you've learned that you would share with other people?
Well, it goes back to an earlier answer. Respect the river always.
I like the way you phrased that. What would people be most surprised to learn about you?
I cook really good scrambled eggs.
Okay, which is not easy, by the way. Like it's not hard to make scrambled eggs, but it is hard to make really good scrambled eggs, I think.
Agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. What is your secret talent?
This is also fishing related. I can put the business end of a 3-weight fly line 60 feet into a hula hoop.
Wow. So you do fly fishing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. What is the most fun you've ever had?
Oh, man. I think probably I body surfing on the North Shore of Antigua with my uncle before he passed away.
That sounds great. What is the scariest thing you've ever done?
I think probably it was starting a PhD in philosophy when there was absolutely no reason to do that. And I had a job offer on the table for secure employment. And instead of taking that, I decided to pursue academic life.
Okay. What was the job offer? Like in what area?
It was a position at the Globe and Mail with the promise of being a foreign correspondent within a couple of years. It was a very nice job, and I turned it down to start a PhD.
Wow.
Which at the time sounded completely crazy.
Yeah. But now you could be working in the rapidly expanding world of mainstream media.
Yeah, that's right.
Look what you missed out on. What is your boldest prediction for the future?
Well, I guess the boldest prediction I want to make is we're still going to be here no matter what happens. I like to think of this as kind of almost a post-apocalyptic moment. We have gone through some very, very bad things, and we're still here. We will muddle through and bash on. That's what humans do.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on post-apocalyptic because you talk about that in your book, and that's a really interesting theme. What would the message be if you were to give a commencement address today to a group of graduating students?
Well, I've actually done 2 of those in my life, and the message for both of them was basically the same, and that was take really good but smart risks.
Okay. Very much on point with your latest book. What has been the greatest turning point in your life so far?
I think it's probably, again, when I decided that I wanted to try to carve out this life as an academic philosopher. And I had these choices on the table. I would say also, though, and maybe this is a little personal, but when I got divorced, I changed my life a lot. And I think that made a big difference, even though that marriage was a good one for the most part. But that was a big turning point.
What has been a recent epiphany for you? Maybe something that you changed your mind about or you discovered?
I think I have learned that I'm much more of a control freak than I thought I was. I always thought I was, but these past months during pandemic have made me realize that I'm even more so that way than I even imagined.
Is there an example that you can share of how the pandemic has brought that out in you?
Well, I spent a lot of time indoors in this one house, and I become almost obsessive compulsive about the way objects are placed around the space. So I keep rearranging things, and it reminds me a bit of a Frasier episode, a Frasier Crane, where he says, this object on his shelf has to be askew, and so I'm constantly putting things askew.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I don't, I'm not going to diagnose anything here, but I mean, I think we're all looking for ways we can control our environment in a time when there's so much that's beyond our control, right?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. And, since many of us are confined to home or spending a lot of time, at least in one place, control becomes very important.
What book, other than the ones you've written, which you would obviously recommend to others, what book are you most likely to recommend to other people?
This may sound unlikely, but I've been thinking about it. Thomas Merton's The Seven-Story Mountain, which I read at a very impressionable age. I was raised in the Catholic tradition. I'm not a theistic believer anymore, but that book, which is a kind of spiritual autobiography, I think is meaningful for anyone who's seeking some sense of what life is about.
Interesting. All right. I really appreciate those answers. Those were really interesting and fun. We're going to take a quick break, and in just a moment, we're going to start digging deep with Mark Kingwell. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, But in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel and how they will react. Abacus Data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus Data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus Data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus Data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus Data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. Mark, once again, thank you for being with us. I wanted to go back to your childhood. Your new book is about risk, and you talked a lot about playing the game of risk as a child. So tell me a little bit about some of those experiences, because I gather it can be a game that goes on forever in a lot of ways. And what you learned from that you have been thinking about today.
Yeah, it's interesting now. There are so many versions of the board game of Risk. There's a Star Wars version, there's a Game of Thrones version. But the original one was a geopolitical exercise, and it had been developed in the 1950s during the Cold War as a kind of learning mechanism for strategizing about geopolitics. And so when I was playing it as a very young person with my brothers and friends, we were living on an Air Force base in Summerside, PEI, which is gone now. And there wasn't a lot to do. There were only a couple of TV channels in those days, and there wasn't anywhere for us to go. There was no town. We were on a base. So we would play these monster games of Risk. And the way it was structured, it's a little bit like Orwell's 1984. There are these power conglomerates, and they push back and forth against each other. And if people recall the novel, it's designed to be infinite in Orwell's nightmare version. What we found was that we could never get that game to resolve itself in any reasonable amount of time. So we had the board set out on the dining room table, and the games would go on for days and days. And you form alliances and break them. You take over territories. You move your armies and materiel around. It was really kind of fascinating. So when I thought about writing about the notion of risk, naturally my thoughts turned back to those early days when I was in, I don't know, probably 12 or 13.
Yeah, and there's something strangely addictive about that game, right? Which there are board games where you're playing them and they're fun for a little while, and then you just kind of want them to end. And but I've found when I've played Risk that I want to keep going, and I've had games of Risk where we've talked about stopping at 11 p.m. and ended up playing at 1 a.m. So
yeah, right. Yeah. No, I think part of it is two things maybe conjoined there. One is natural human curiosity that we don't always want things to come to an end or a conclusion. We do crave that. I mean, it's one reason we watch films and read novels that have standard kind of Aristotelian narrative structure. But we also crave this kind of ongoing thing that doesn't resolve. And then, of course, for us at the time, this was the 70s, but the Cold War was still very much on our minds, even though we were young. Because we were in a military family, it was more acute maybe than for some other people. But that idea of the power struggle that never resolves itself is very compelling. And yeah, so we would play and play and play. And when I think about it now, it's really kind of fascinating to think because normally we think of young boys, especially, as having relatively limited attention spans. But there was something about that game, about that board and the pieces that just kept us going on and on.
Yeah. So let's talk a little more about risk, because I think we as a species are really not very good at understanding it, calculating it, using it to our advantage, responding to it. Why do you think that is? Why do we not have a good relationship with risk?
Well, you're absolutely right. First of all, we're not good at it, and there's overwhelming bodies of evidence about how we're not good at it. I think part of it, if you want to be really anthropological about it, it's because our brains are still modeled, hardwired for fight or flight, and so we tend to flee or confront. And I mean, of course, we have rational capacity, but the rational capacity is kind of layered on top of those more primal aspects of our hardwiring. And so that makes it very difficult for us to calculate risk in rational ways, in ways that are going to be advantageous. Hence, we derive mechanisms. So, for example, insurance schemes are basically attempts at rationally distributing risk, because we know of our own experience that we're not good at it as individuals, and so we try to spread out the risk across a population of, say, investors, like in the original Lloyd's of London, or any insurance scheme, and then we invent scientific ways, actuarial science, for example, to try to understand that. But if you think about how that collides with gambling, and I talk about both of these things in my little book, people love to take risks. So they love to do things where the odds are actually against them. And even if they know the odds are against them, partly because if you win against those odds, you feel really good. So this is, anthropological, psychological, philosophical, a whole bunch of things are colliding when we think about how we respond to our confrontations with risk.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you put it that way, it made me think about some other themes that you raised in the book. It's worth pointing out that everyone experiences the world through entirely through their own eyes and through their own experience, and so it's almost like the value of risk or chance or luck spread out over, or odds spread out over, a large number of events is meaningless to us because we're only one person, right? We're only making one bet in a particular instance, right? So telling somebody that if 1 million people did this, 990,000 of them would have this outcome, and 100,000 would, or whatever the right number is there, 10,000 would have this outcome. The doesn't mean anything because you're just making one play.
Yeah. So part of that is the you might call it the egotistical exceptionalism, where you think, well, yeah, I understand that those are the odds across a population, but I'm a sovereign individual and I'm making this throw or this bet, buying this ticket. And the fact is that, especially with games of chance, which are only one part of this whole universe of odds distribution, people do win. And the fact that people do win makes other people think that they might win. And hence the kinds of bets, sometimes very bad bets, that people make. I mean, if you were actually cognizant of the odds and taking that in, there are a whole bunch of things you would never do. But the fact is, behind that, upstream of that, if you like, is the truth that risk is life. I mean, to get out of bed in the morning is a risk. To walk down the hallway, to go into your bathroom, to go into your kitchen, to go out on the street. So there's no avoiding risk in human life, in human affairs. I think really the only big philosophical lesson I wanted to push in this book is we can be better at critically thinking about risk. And there are social and political lessons here too, which I hope we can get into.
Yeah, absolutely. We're making bets all the time, even if we don't think we're making bets, right? Every step we take is a gamble.
Yeah, exactly right.
Sorts. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when you think about, if you think about chance or luck only in the context of games of chance, like going to Las Vegas or a casino somewhere, that's a very artificial and framed version of what is in fact a background reality of every moment of waking life, well, sleeping life too, of mortality.
Yeah. Now, you touched on something there too, which I wanted to talk about, which is that we tend to place more value on narratives than on odds, right? We like anecdotes, we like stories, and so that's why if we hear a story of somebody winning a lottery, we buy into the idea that we could win the lottery, even if the odds are stacked against us. And I would say this might help us bridge into some of the social and political elements of this, but I take exception with the narrative of in America everybody can grow up to be president. Number one, because it's not true. The presidents have a tendency to, even Barack Obama was a very wealthy guy who went to Harvard before he became president, even though he was exceptional in other ways. But also because even if everybody in America did have an equal chance of becoming president, only one person at a time can actually do it, right?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things to pull out from your comment, Mark. One is, yeah, absolutely, we are addicted to narrative, and it's partly because we need it to make sense of our mortal span. So we have this, what philosophers call a recursive tendency. So when something happens, we fold it back into the previous things that happened, and we try to make sense of it as part of a kind of logical progression, even if it's a very disruptive moment. I was thinking about your rapid fire questions. Isolating these things is difficult, partly because we all have this texture of storytelling that is part of our consciousness. And then related to that very closely is this idea that each one of us is the most important person in our own experience. So even though there are now 8 billion humans on the planet, something like that, each one of us thinks that we are singularly important. And from the cosmic point of view, of course, we're not. But we need to think that if we're going to go on day to day. So then, yeah, those things link up to this idea that, well, there's somebody who did something or achieved something. Maybe I can too. And the buying a lottery ticket is a very minor and very low cost version of that. But the kinds of competition and hierarchy and status seeking that structure a lot of society are potentially far more harmful versions of that. So yeah, there's this idea that to take your specific example, the so-called American dream, and then it's not confined to America, but aspirational psychology, which is in everything from fashion magazines to economics 101 classes, is actually not aligning with reality, but people still nevertheless are drawn to it because we need to believe that these possibilities exist.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about our relationship with death, I hope, coming up, because I think there's another paradox there, similar to what you just described about how none of us matters in the big scheme of things, but each of us matters enormously to ourselves. In the same way, we have this strange relationship with death where we all acknowledge it, but sort of really can't come to terms with the fact that it's going to happen. But before we do that, let's dig a little deeper into the social aspects of this. You write about risk is always political. What do you mean by that? And how do issues like risk and danger, fairness and justice, how do all of those things kind of fit together in our society?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, this is the most important part of this little book. And I should say that I was writing about these things before the COVID-19 pandemic. I was fascinated by the geography of risk, the way risk is distributed, not just across populations, but also spatial arrangements like neighborhoods or cities, regions. But then, of course, when the pandemic started, it was obvious that I had to sort of pivot, and then everything was inflected by that reality, which we're still dealing with. But I think it only heightens the background questions, and those are things like this. Philosophers like to call this luck egalitarianism, or the region of justice theory, where you assess luck. If there are things beyond your control that condition your outcomes in life, perhaps profoundly, uh, is that something that should be addressed as a justice issue, or is that merely misfortune? Is it part of the birthright lottery, or just the random distribution of life chances? And I think I'm on the side of arguing that these are justice issues and we should be addressing them. It's a vast territory to wade into, because you think about not just the difference between, say, I don't know, different neighborhoods in Toronto or Chicago or New York, places where I've lived, but between North America and Africa. You're talking about really, really challenging and deep-seated problems of distribution. And once you start thinking about that, you can't think about risk the same way again, because you can't just say, oh, it's an indifferent universe and it's just like a lottery, and it just falls out the way it falls out. No, there are social and political conditions that shape this whole area and the way we should be thinking about it. So that's, I think, the most important political point to come out of all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about lotteries, and you also talk about in the book about how we didn't choose to be born, but it's kind of like we were all forced into a lottery, whether we wanted to be in one or not. And some of us, by being born in Canada, by being born into certain economic circumstances, into households with two loving parents, into certain races or genders, some of us won that lottery and other people lost badly, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And so then the question becomes, I mean, once you recognize that that was a lottery, you have to start recognizing the double-sided problem. Because on the one side, some of the winners think that they deserve what they won, that they have it by merit. The classic joke, I think I mentioned this in the book, it's about George W. Bush, who nowadays looks like a pretty good president of the United States. But
yeah, everybody misses him all of a sudden.
Yeah. But the joke about him was that he was born on third base and thought he'd hit a triple.
Yeah.
And so you have to recognize that side, that sheer luck is not the same as desert or merit. And then the flip is also true. Somebody who is systematically disadvantaged is not lacking in virtue or substance. They're fighting and fighting against circumstance. So when we start thinking about this stuff in terms of policy, which I only talk about right at the very end of my book, they're more prescriptions than policy discussions, but this kind of luck egalitarianism digs really deep. To speak to the title of your podcast, that we could be thinking about really quite radical reevaluations, redistributions. Again, the pandemic only heightens our awareness of this, because this is one thing I've been saying. People put up signs, or you heard people say, "We're all in this together." Well, yeah, in one sense that's true, because the virus doesn't discriminate between persons. It's just there. But on the other hand, we know now with vast amounts of evidence that Black people in the US, Indigenous people in Canada, poor people and elderly people everywhere are suffering far more than those of us who have the means and the wealth, frankly, to protect ourselves.
Yeah. Even just the distribution in terms of jobs, right? That you and I can work from home, for example, but other people have to go and work at the grocery store or that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't need to get on public transit to get to my place of work, and I don't need to deal with people every day, especially people who might be flouting some public health recommendations. And we've heard not all too many stories of these poor employees who bear the brunt of having to enforce public health measures that one should think were simply straightforward common sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about the birthright lottery, I've called it the ovarian lottery sometimes. I think that's a term from Warren Buffett. That there's not only do some people get born on third base and other people don't, but that sort of luck multiplies and reinforces itself over the course of life. It's almost like it's hard it's hard to create unlucky circumstances for people who start out lucky, or to create lucky circumstances for people who start out unlucky.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's another way of saying the rich get richer, but I think it's deeper than that actually, because the rich get richer because they have money to invest, and investment is a reward for being lucky enough to have money in the first place. But it's not just money; it's life chances, it's the sense of opportunity, the idea that you're entitled, and these things are they're not simply monetary. They're social and cultural, and that's why when you think about these kinds of justice issues, creating a sense of potential and derailing a sense of entitlement. These are very kind of spectral things, but they're necessary. It's not just about a taxation scheme, for example, or even universal basic income, which I argue for right at the end of the book. I think those things are very important, but we're talking about political and cultural things as well, attitudes.
One of the challenges of this, though, is that I think we can acknowledge you and I were born on a certain side of that line. Obviously, right? We were born into privilege, but the people who end up making the decisions about how wealth is distributed and how we respond to even accepting that there is an unfairness to the distribution of resources in the world are typically all people who were born on that side of the line. So there isn't really a personal incentive for them to make changes, right?
Yeah, I think that's an enduring problem, and we've been seeing some interesting shifts in this diversification of the political class, of the policy making class. Um, but you're right. It's historically been the people who have relative degrees of privilege who can or cannot make those decisions. So then it becomes a matter of conscience. And that, again, is very hard to talk about, except philosophically, because you can't leverage conscience just by giving people, say, financial incentives, right? There's no financial incentive to be a good person or to pursue justice. There have to be different kinds of incentives. I don't know what you want to call them, spiritual, philosophical. And so then it's a matter of duty. And that's it's an old-fashioned word, but I think it's appropriate. If you have these privileges, the first thing is to recognize that you do, and then take responsibility, and then try to make the world a better place. I mean, in a way, it seems simple, but I've seen so many people fail to do that, any of those things. And therefore, it just seems more and more urgent that those of us who can recognize these lessons should pursue them.
So another way that risk plays out in society, obviously, is when there is a crisis like the pandemic, and decisions have to be made. For example, about reopening bars and restaurants or schools and those sorts of things, or erring in the other direction and locking everybody down and containing the virus, both of which are undesirable outcomes and can cause harm to people. And how we balance those things against each other, and how we balance them against economic considerations, and so on. And um, I find that, this year has been a very high profile example of that, but we make those kinds of calculations as a society all the time. There's a perception, I think, sometimes that we do everything we can to prevent harm and to prevent death, but we don't, because as an example, we let people travel in their cars at high speeds on highways, even though we accept that there's going to be a few thousand deaths every year as a result of that. So we do make those kinds of decisions as a society all the time, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And I guess, again, another thing that the pandemic has brought to our attention is precisely that point, that we're making, not always consciously or explicitly, risk assessments all the time. So yeah, if you lock down everybody in their houses, then we could probably eliminate the virus. But then a whole bunch of people would die from the lockdown, and a whole bunch of businesses would fail. If we let everybody do whatever they wanted, then yeah, a whole bunch of people would die, and the virus might or might not, burn itself out through herd immunity. So I mean, we're trying to find a way through all of this, and that's exactly what we do all the time. So, the highway driving example is a good one. We have speed limits. People exceed them all the time. We have some degree of enforcement when they do. And basically, we tolerate marginal harms, namely car crashes, as part of the bargain of allowing people to go about their business. And that's just, the way it is. And so, you recall the early days when people were saying, oh, this is just like the regular flu. It's no worse. We just have to deal with it. It's mostly elderly people who are going to die anyway. I mean, in future years, we might actually take that kind of view of COVID, because it's probably going to stay with us. And so we will kind of fold it into our everyday risk assessments. But I guess what I want to say about all that is just what you said, really. We have to be smart and explicit about the kinds of choices that we're making. What is the plan? What is our public health policy? How are people responding to it? If everybody's speeding, then a whole lot of people die. So if most people are driving at the limit or below it, and you can tolerate a couple of speeders, and you've got some police, that's basically an equilibrium system, more or less. You're going to have marginal costs, but we can tolerate those. I think that's the best we can hope for when it comes to human nature.
Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, politics and public policy feel this pressure to sort of compromise. It's interesting because I've just been reading this book about negotiating called "Never Split the Difference," and about how the author of the book, Chris Voss, uses this example of if somebody's recommending you wear black shoes and you want to wear brown shoes, the compromise would be to wear one of each, which of course is the worst possible outcome. And we do things like that all the time. And I feel like, in the context of the coronavirus, we sort of go back and forth between, okay, let's hurt the economy, but lock everybody down to stem the flow of the expansion of the virus. Oh, well, now the economy's hurting, so let's do the opposite of that. And then we'll flip back, and then we'll, that unfortunately is the pressure of the reality of politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, that's a great example, because we were talking about how we lack sufficient rationality sometimes, but you can be too rational. So there's that, I think I'm getting this right, thought experiment on the basis of efficiency, and artificial intelligence decides that a company's profit margin is maximized on buying paper clips. So it eliminates every other sector of purchasing and just buys thousands and thousands and thousands of paper clips because that's the good return on investment.
Right. Yeah.
So we are humans after all, right? We're not entirely rational, and maybe we shouldn't be entirely rational in that kind of maximizing sense. It's always a balancing act, and like I said, people want to live their lives. They want to feel free. They want to pursue their goals. Those are worthy ambitions, and they need to be respected because that's at the root of all of this. So, you can't even talk about the sorts of things I'm talking about in justice theory unless you start from a position of personhood being an essential value.
So you talk about learning to die in the book. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. So this is an idea that goes back at least to Socrates in the Western tradition. The famous dialogues of Plato, especially the Phaedo and the Crito, where Socrates has been condemned to death, and the Apology. Um, and and what he says is the deep wisdom of being alive is knowing that life comes to an end. And so that's what it means to learn how to die. As I say in the book, this is not some kind of death cult. We're not,
Yeah.
it's not vampires on the loose. Or zombies. It's having that wisdom that uh, mortality is the horizon of meaning in human life. And to reference another philosopher, Martin Heidegger, said death is our own most possibility, which is to say something like this: nobody can do it for us. This is a job that you can't outsource, uh, and it's always present. But we tend to keep it at a distance because we need to go about our business. We need to live our lives, and that's the way it has to be. We have to remember, but not every single moment, because if we remembered every single moment, we wouldn't do anything. And it's a bit like risk in general. If you thought about the odds of your being injured walking from your bedroom to your bathroom, you'd stay in bed all day. You can't do that. So it's a bit like that, only on a larger scale.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think this is another thing we're bad at in a lot of ways is accepting it, understanding it, and applying that in some way to our lives. I think we do acknowledge it enough to sort of say, yeah, here's a bunch of things I want to do before I die, or it does create that sort of urgency or deadline. But it reminds me, I think it was Stephen Wright who had that joke of I want to live forever, so far so good.
Yeah.
That we all know that there's a 100% chance of our death, but on any given day, the odds of us dying are so small. And for most of us, the odds of us dying in the next 3 months are so incredibly small that it's very easy to forget that, right?
Yeah. Well, and as I say, I think it's kind of necessary in a way to forget that so that you can pursue your projects, because our projects are hugely important. I think there's another quotation from Woody Allen that I think I put in the book, which is, "I don't want to live on in the memory of my friends. I want to live on in my apartment."
Yeah.
Well, none of us gets to do that. And yeah, as Jim Morrison said, nobody here gets out alive. But you know what? This is, and maybe this is just kind of traditional philosophical wisdom, but I think it sustains me anyway from day to day. That urgency is the meaning of life. It's that you sense that the importance of doing things and making connections, sustaining relationships, creating a better world if you can, being part of community. Why do we do anything? I think we do things. Of course, we can be selfish and egotistical, but I think the whatever the better angels of our nature are directed towards making these things that matter, knowing that we're going to not be here forever.
Yeah, and I guess here's what I struggle with is can we ever really come to terms with that, or is it just some of us are able to use religion and the afterlife, or use some sort of new agey outlook about impermanence and that sort of thing to convince ourselves that we're okay with it when deep down we're not. Maybe I'm talking more about myself here than anything, but
well, that is a profound question. And I mentioned having been raised in the Catholic tradition. I think I understand the religious outlook at least a little bit, and the need to have that. As the saying goes, if God doesn't exist, we would have to invent him anyway. I think for me, it's a question of mental toughness. To accept that this is the one and only go round, and not to seek solace in something else, but to make this one and only spin at the wheel matter the most that it can. It's not easy. I mean, we all know that. But I also think, there are these stages that we go through. So you and I think, are about the same age, and we've probably seen death up close, but we've also seen youth and sustaining ambition and possibility. So every new generation brings into the world a sense of optimism and hope, and that is good for everybody. So the 20-year-old who thinks that he or she is immortal is delusional, but also valuable.
Right. There's
yeah.
a usefulness to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because you quote The Simpsons a lot, which I deeply appreciate. And I remember this time when Homer Simpson was just talking about the events that had happened in one episode and said something about, to Lisa that, there is no point to this. It's just a bunch of stuff that happens. And sometimes I wonder if that's what life is, as hard as we try to attach meaning to it. But then on the other hand, I think it really is up to us to inject meaning. We have the capacity to create meaningfulness out of what would otherwise not have meaning.
Yeah. I mean, one way I think about this is, people often say Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, is a nihilist. He declares the death of God. But what I think Nietzsche means by nihilism is that we are the only creatures who create meaning. So meaning is a human function. It's a function of our consciousness. And the universe is indifferent. I mean, we have to accept that. But that indifference is actually an opportunity, not a kind of void. And we know that. I mean, we're language users. Language itself is a structure of meaning. It bespeaks being and connection. And I think that if you accept that, then that's the only kind of immortality we can aspire to.
Very interesting. A lot of people are making predictions right now in the midst of this crisis, which I think is a bad time to do it. But you write about how the future doesn't exist. It only exists after we create it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess that goes back to that rapid fire question. So I talk about this in terms of post-apocalyptic, and there's a whole genre of post-apocalyptic novels and films, and most of them are dystopian. Skynet takes over the world, whatever. I mean, everybody knows the references. I mean something different by that here. I mean something that I derive from reading one of my great mentors, Jonathan Lear, who's now at the University of Chicago. He was at Yale when I was in grad school there, who writes about what he calls radical hope. And he was specifically referencing the Lakota in the American West, and how there was a sense in which certain kinds of events changed circumstances so that there was no future left. In not just the Lakota, but especially the Crow people. So the Crow people really lost their identity under those conditions. And I think we can see this in Indigenous First Nations here in Canada too, where you feel like the chance of a future has been taken away. And so what Lear argues is that there is a possibility there for a post-apocalyptic, post-historical, or something like that notion of hope, where it's not optimism or specific expectation, but just the idea that we endure. And though meaning may have been drained from a certain cluster of identity at a certain point, it's not gone forever. So the Crow live on, the Lakota live on, we humans live on past this pandemic. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at with this idea of post-apocalyptic radical hope.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about that is I think we've all, without perhaps labeling it, we've all experienced it on some level. When you go through a crisis, you lose a loved one, you have something happen that feels like the end of the world, you losing a job maybe, or something traumatic, and you emerge from the other side of it with kind of an opportunity, and not to diminish how devastating some of these events can be to some people, but you emerge from it with some form of opportunity, some form of clean slate almost, to say, okay, well, I've already, this horrible thing has already happened to me and I'm still here. And so now what do I do? And that actually presents an opportunity, and to use some, because you refer to gambling a lot in the book, it's like house money, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, to go back to that point about the future, I think people often tend to think of the future as this kind of temporal bulldozer that's just coming at us, and it's inevitable. It's got this shape that we can maybe discern, but it's bound to be very devastating. And I think that actually robs us of agency, because we are the ones who create the future. The future only has meaning because we have collective ways of thinking about what makes meaning. And so, I talk about this. I've talked about it in several places. It's not preserved in English, but in French, two different words for future: l'avenir and le futur. And l'avenir is what is to come. Le futur has a much more kind of blocky connotation. And I love this idea of accepting what we call the future as what is to come, and being open to that. There's another French word that I love, which is savoir attendre, it's knowing how to wait. And that too, I think, is part of this, that we're all waiting, and it's active waiting. It's to link up to some other writing I've done. It's like the active waiting of a baseball player in the field when the pitch is being dealt to the batter. You are absolutely attentive, absolutely poised for action, but things haven't happened yet. When they do, you will respond and you will create whatever the play is.
Yeah, but in that moment, the future is not ordained. It's not been written. It's what happens when that pitch arrives at the plate, and you either swing or don't swing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, every pitch is a gamble. Every swing is a gamble. Yeah, not to be too baseball about it, but I was watching the World Series, so it's on my mind.
Yeah, me too. We could get sidetracked with baseball for sure, because we both are fans. I want to come back to some of the thoughts about luck and the birthright lottery and so on, because one of the really insightful things that I took away from the book was about how our perception of risk, our willingness to take on risk, is also in a way a result of an unfair distribution, that some of us are more likely to accept risk, or more likely to gamble in ways that will benefit us over time, to take chances, to try things. And that is an uneven distribution that we perhaps attribute more to character or values than to luck, right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I'm not a psychologist, so I'm working into that topic philosophically instead. But yeah, there is clearly an uneven distribution of risk tolerance and risk aversion across populations. Some people are entrepreneurs, they put their life savings on the line, or they open restaurants, or they create crazy innovative technologies that they have no idea are necessarily going to work. Other people are very interested in keeping safe, and putting a bunch of money in the savings account and locking things down. So uh, it isn't really about character. I think that's another mistake that we make. It is more like just psychology. Some people uh, like to play contact sports and other people don't. That's not really a matter of character. But I think we often tend to think about risk taking as a matter of character, in part because its benefits, when the risks pay off, are often good for everyone. Not always, but often. So
Yeah.
when a tech startup succeeds, then we all get fancy new iPhones or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and somebody took a risk, but it wasn't us, but we still get the payoff. Or take a more basic example. I use a lot of military metaphors, partly because of my upbringing. But if someone does a daring move on the battlefield and wins the battle, and maybe then wins the war, everybody benefits. So risk taking, risk tolerance is actually really, really important to human survival and thriving. But we don't all have it. And I think we should just recognize that as another one of those. I think I talk about different levels of
Yeah.
distribution risk, and that's one of them. That you know, some of us are more tolerant, and some of us are less. What's interesting right now, of course, is personal expressions of risk tolerance are being refigured as collective expressions of risk aversion. So that's the mask debate in a nutshell,
Mm.
right? So should you wear a mask when you go outside? The risk taker says, I don't care. I'll take my chances. I'll get the virus. But the community says, wait, it's not just about you. We have risk aversion to your spreading the virus. So that's a really interesting clash of these things about tolerance and aversion.
One of the things that I thought about when I read that section about our tolerance for risk is, again, to go back to luck and fortune, is that when you talk about bets, some of us, we all may look at the odds and see there's a 1 in 10 chance of being successful at something, and some of us may take that 1 in 10 chance. And really successful people may actually be able to make the bet 10 times, which means they have a high likelihood of one of those paying off. Many of us only get to do it once, and some of us would have a willingness to do that, and others would not. But beyond that, we only write about it. Typically, we only write the stories of the people who make the 1 in 10 or the 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 bets and are successful. We don't often talk about the 999 in 1,000 who made that bet and didn't succeed, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It ties back to a couple of things that have come up already. If you are blessed in one kind of circumstance, you can be more risk tolerant
Yeah.
because you've got cushioning. And I talk about this especially in the geography of risk. Wealthy people build multi-million dollar homes in earthquake prone areas because they know if the earthquake hits and they lose their home, they can build another home. Um, so that's a bit like the taking the 10 bets of 1 in 10. Um, and yeah, and again, it ties back to the narrative thing because we focus on winners, not losers. I remember driving through Montana with a friend of mine he's now the director of the Field Museum in Chicago, and we were going fishing, and there are these sad little closet casinos, like shopfront casinos, in all these towns in Montana. and we drove by one, and he said, "There it is, the Palace of Broken Dreams." It's like, and
Yeah.
it's true. I mean, that's not like your uh, big whale wheeler dealer in Las Vegas. That's just somebody sad gambling away their monthly paycheck, with no cushion at all.
Yeah. So I want to come back to a few things that you raised early on. Everything I know is from cats. I'd love to hear one lesson you've learned from your cats.
Well, for one thing, they are geniuses of sleep. And
Yeah.
I'm an insomniac, so I keep waking up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep. And I look at them, and the way they curl up into sleep is the most amazing thing to me. They're also geniuses of play. They understand when they're biting each other that it's not war, it's play, and I think that's an important lesson. Um, and they remind me that everybody needs to be fed.
Yes, very true. And there's an interesting thing there too, because I think we take much better care of pets than we do of other people in the world. And again, that comes back to our expectation that people should be able to look after themselves, which we don't expect of cats and dogs, right?
That is so true. And, it reminds me before I had these two cats that I have now, I had another cat who got very ill. And we took her to the vet, and she was terminal. And so we had her put to sleep. And it was devastating. And then I went to talk to a colleague of mine, and I think I was still very emotional. And she said, we treat our pets better than we treat our families sometimes. And I'm not sure what I think about euthanasia as a sort of public policy, health policy thing. But I do think that we sometimes pay more attention to suffering when it is in these vulnerable animals that we bring into our lives, and we neglect the humans.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find it hard to have a definitive position about assisted dying and euthanasia and that sort of thing, but I certainly understand the motivation behind it, and I understand, and I also, I guess if I had to choose, I would say it's my life. I should get to do what I want with it, including my death, right? That it
Yeah,
doesn't
and
belong to anybody else.
yeah, I think it's also, for me, I think I often think in etymological terms, and the Greek roots of euthanasia always strike me. It's
Hmm.
the prefix eu usually means beautiful, or yeah, something like beautiful. So euthanatos, why wouldn't you want that if that's your choice?
Yeah. I want to go back to when you said 1996 was a tough year. The job market wasn't great. You had made this decision to go after a PhD in philosophy, obviously, and turn down this, what would have been, I mean, we joked about the future of the media, but it would have been a great job at the Globe and Mail, and you would have had some great experiences. And I think, I'm sure everybody, you know, anybody who pursues a career in academics always gets confronted with that question of, well, what are you going to do with that, right? What are you going to do
Yeah.
with a PhD in philosophy? How's that going to pay the bills, right? So can you just walk through kind of how you got through that period and what you learned from it?
Yeah, sure. A couple of details stand out in my memory. One is I was waiting for a bus in the queue in Edinburgh, where I was doing my master's degree, and this woman asked me, she heard my accent, so she knew I wasn't Scottish. She asked me what I was doing, and I told her I was in graduate school in philosophy. And she didn't just say, "What are you going to do with that?" She said, "Do you have any idea what you're going to do with that?" Which puts a pretty sharp point on it.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of judgment in that question.
well, there's lots to learn waiting for buses in
In
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh,
Uh,
yeah, sure. Yeah, the Scottish can get right to the point.
and I guess the other memory is my older brother, who is now retired, at the time was having his own career crisis, and he flew over to Scotland, and we went around the country on trains and did a bunch of hiking, and we got into this very, very long conversation about ambition and life. And he was trained as an engineer, and at that time he couldn't find any work, and then went on to have a very successful career. And I think that was a turning point for me, because just realizing that you're not alone when you're confronting these choices. And I mean, of course, everybody who's making a choice to go into academia, especially humanities, maybe especially philosophy, I don't know, knows that they're up against it. That's a high risk activity. But here's my brother, who is and was a brilliant engineer, and he couldn't find anything either. That actually helped me a lot.
Mm. And I wanted to come back to the story about you slipping and getting very seriously hurt, which you allude to in the book, but I don't think you tell the whole story there. And this was when you were fishing. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, I've written about it elsewhere. I didn't want to go into it again too much in the book, but just that. Yeah, I was fishing. There's a river near Lake Placid in upstate New York called the Ausable, and it's well known for having these large, sort of slime color covered boulders. Um, and many fishing writers, famous fishing writers, have written about it. It's a very challenging river, and I made a couple of mistakes. I went alone, which you should never do. You should always have a buddy. And it was twilight, and I was desperate. So I guess that's three mistakes for fly fishing. So I was trying to get my cast into a pool on the far side of the river, and the only way I thought I could was by making this step across a couple of boulders. I slipped as I tried to make the step. I slammed my shoulder into the other boulder, and then I fell back into the river. And I didn't realize right away, but I had dislocated my shoulder, my right shoulder, and my waders were filling up with water, and I barely got out of the river. Then I had to. I'm laughing about it, but it wasn't funny. I had to get the waders off, and then walk barefoot about 2 miles back to my car, which was a standard transmission,
Oh,
that I had to then drive another 3 miles to the hospital in Lake Placid. And this is another memory. I didn't know where the hospital was, so I stopped at a gas station, and I walk in. So I'm barefoot, soaked, and I'm if anybody knows what a dislocated shoulder feels like, basically your arm is hanging by
yeah.
your tendons, and I'm sure I'm pale as milk. And I asked the young woman behind the counter how to get to the hospital, and it was almost like one of those scenes in No Country for Old Men. Like, it's like, do you see this every day? Like, somebody walks in like this. And anyway, I got to the hospital, and I got my arm. They call it reducted, which is kind of nice, but it's extremely painful. And the other thing is, it's never the same after that. So I've dislocated it 2 more times since then.
Oh,
Yeah, but I think, when I think about that story, I think it's probably my closest brush with death, and which is lucky. I mean, I'm in my middle to late 50s. I haven't had too many mortal challenges, thank God.
yeah. And as you say, this is something you could learn from and avoid repeating, obviously.
Respect the river.
Respect the river, absolutely. You finish the book with some very specific recommendations around some very interesting things like universal basic income, and you also talk about having more tax on inherited wealth and less on income and those sorts of things. Do you have any advice for individuals? Like, those are public policy proposals, which I think are very constructive. But when you look at the whole issue of luck and fortune and mortality and all the other themes you explore, are there any prescriptions you have for individuals?
Well, I guess the main one is something we've talked about a bit already, which is just acknowledge your entitlement. Just take stock of your circumstance and realize that there are probably people who are worse off than you, and what that might mean, for how you conduct yourself. You know, Again, I have been tremendously lucky and privileged in my life, and so I try to acknowledge that and do whatever I can. But and I guess the other thing is, this goes back to the point you emphasized a couple of times, Mark. Listen to people's stories, because even though there are so many of us, it's just inevitable that we think of ourselves in terms of those stories, and everybody has one, and that's what it means to be conscious, to be a person. And I think respecting personhood means respecting the story.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Is there any trick to the scrambled eggs that you can share with us?
Don't use a frying pan, use a saucepan, and keep stirring.
Okay. Keep stirring. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen, there's a video of Gordon Ramsay, which I only saw recently, of him making scrambled eggs without mixing the egg before he puts it in the pan. And
I've never
really
tried.
interesting. Yeah.
I've never tried that, but that sounds like an interesting experiment. I guess two other things I would say is a little bit of Tabasco and a little bit of cheddar cheese.
Okay. Great stuff. Mark, this has been really, really interesting and thought-provoking, and I've enjoyed our conversation immensely, just as I did the book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been really great to be with you.
I learned so much from this conversation. I really like the perspective that Mark shared about understanding risk, about learning how to die, about the birthright lottery, and how someone who is systemically disadvantaged is not lacking in virtue. I think that's a really important point. Oh, and of course, that bit about what he learned from cats was great. I really enjoyed his latest book, which is called On Risk. I encourage you to check it out. You can find out more about that and other aspects of our conversation in the show notes on our website, which is letsdigdeep.com. Also, at letsdigdeep.com, you can dig into more topics and lessons like this, subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and read my daily blog. Once again, thank you to Mark Kingwell for joining us on Digging Deep. Please review this episode and share it with others. Thank you for listening.